45 years ago, the NAACP filed a lawsuit that ultimately became known as Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court decision that would change the face of American public education. But did it? Segregated schools, yesterday and today, ahead on Wide Angle. Back in 1963, as the Civil Rights Act awaited its fate, President Kennedy observed, and I quote, "Simple justice requires that public funds, to which all taxpayers of all races contribute, not be spent in any fashion which encourages, entrenches, subsidizes, or results in discrimination." End quote. From our vantage over 50 years later, the sentiment perhaps strikes us as reasonable, if not earth-shakingly new or original. Yet forces swirling around America's public schools today continue to imperil them, and, by extension, our children. Joining me from her office in Ithaca, New York, to discuss the re-segregation of our schools is Professor Noliwe Rooks. Dr. Rooks is the Director of American Studies and Associate Professor of Africana Studies at Cornell University. She is also the author of 4 books, including most recently, Cutting School, Privatization, Segregation, and the End of Public Education, the basis of our conversation today. Welcome to Wide Angle, Professor Rooks.
Thank you so much for having me.
A pleasure. I certainly referenced Brown versus the Board of Education in the introduction, and it deserves that distinction, I think, insofar as it was the case around which issues of education and skin color in this country revolved, back in '54. I'd certainly like to spend the bulk of our conversation today discussing events post-Brown, post-1954. However, I would like to give viewers a sense of the context that existed beforehand. School experiences for black children, for white children in both the South and the North prior to that, so that we can maybe have a better understanding of what's going on today. If you could.
Sure, yeah. Issues that you started with talking about John F. Kennedy and talking about taxes and taxpayers are actually really central to the development of education in the United States, North and South, and for different races. Certainly in the North, Massachusetts, where you're located,
right.
Had taxpayer-supported education from the 1600s going forward, some forms.
Okay.
It was a form then of sort of citizenship. So for the wealthy went to private schools. The wealthy were always educated in a kind of classical sense. Right. European, Latin, high culture. Right. But as immigration started to swell the rolls in the North, a really kind of vigorous debate broke out about, well, what do we do with them? Do they need education? Right. What kind of education? Why is education important? And Massachusetts and other northern states were really in the forefront of saying that, we need education for citizenship. If we're going to turn and help folks who are from lower classes actually achieve a citizenship ideal, education for folks then in the 1700s, 1800s was central and key. So you did have some forms for some folks. It was not universal, right. But you could find it. In the South, however, education pre-Civil War, pretty much even for poor whites, was non-existent. The wealthy in the South often sent their kids north, often to Massachusetts, some of the older boarding schools for education. And so in that way, education was really a marker of class, because North or South, you still had people who were educated in the same institutions, in the same kinds of subjects. Right. For poor people and people of color in the South, in particular, the idea of education it was just a non-starter. Right. It was really only for the planter class. Right. Right. So post-Reconstruction, one of the things that the Civil War brought to the South and subsequently to the country as a whole really was this idea of education being something that should be while it was never enshrined in the Constitution, it is important to note we've never had an amendment that says that that you have a constitutional right to an education.
Yeah.
However, during the post-Reconstruction period, because federal funds were sent south to educate Black and white both, you really get the first beginnings of a widespread experiment in public education for all citizens, regardless of class and regardless of race.
Okay.
What happens post-Reconstruction, though, is the funds start to dry up as that period, which is a 13-year period. Federal troops are maintaining order, are really trying to keep the country from falling into civil war again. Right. Once they leave, the idea of the education funds are really popular with politicians all over the former slaveholding South. And because so many poor and middle class, working class whites have now had access to education, they're clamoring for it. The idea of going back to a period where they're not able to sit in classrooms to learn the basics of reading and writing, are not tenable anymore. But the problem becomes how to fund it, because taxes are only going so far, and so for a period of time, the money that the federal government is sending south specifically to educate the formerly enslaved population becomes the pot of money that southern states turn to educate their own.
Right. Okay. So that gives us sort of a sense of North and South, a sense of what expectations become. Certainly around the Civil War time, there is this expanding idea in the country, and perhaps it's more northern than it is southern, about a compulsory public education that would be provided to children. Yes?
Yes.
Okay. The law in the land around that time, post-Civil War, 1896, is separate and equal. Yes, it's a Plessy versus Ferguson ruling. Yes. 2 generations later, we come to 1956, where the Warren Court decides that separate implies inherently unequal. They turn the previous understanding on its ear. However, that the Supreme Court decides that segregation is unconstitutional doesn't necessarily mean that there is an America that is willing to help realize that vision of integration and that vision for the future. Yeah, and in fact, not an insignificant portion of white Americans in both the South and the North resisted the prospects of integration. How did that unfold? How did that resistance unfold? I guess maybe I have a 3-part question here for you, and I'll remind you of the pieces later. How did that unfold? What did the government do in response? And what did the Black community do in order to support its children?
Yeah, so talking about education in the South, in the North either, but we can just start in the South.
Sure.
During this period where you're going from separate but equal to the idea of integration, you can't separate it from the idea of white supremacy. Mm-hmm. So following the Civil War, when the troops left, one of the first things that starts to happen is all of the rights. I mean, during Reconstruction, you had Black people being elected to political office. Voting rights were instated for the first time for people of African descent. Right. You had Black institutions beginning to thrive. Mm-hmm. In educational levels, white and Black. I mean, it is important to note during Reconstruction. I mean, again, because poor whites had not had access to education either. The numbers of people filling schools are doubling and tripling, and that's true for African Americans as well. Okay. Once those troops leave, it becomes clear the extent to which the white people in the South, many white people, powerful white people, people who were actually making policy, who were the sheriffs, the police people, really, this was an opportunity for them to reinstitute their domination. They would not been at all happy about these federal troops telling them what they could do, what they couldn't do, the laws that they could institute. So almost immediately, two areas, once the troops left, that governments, one after another, start to go after are voting rights and education. Right. And all across the South, what starts to happen is governments say, well, they make it illegal for there to be integrated education. So you can't, white and black cannot sit in school buildings together. They make it illegal to spend money on the education of black children. And because it's a states' rights issue at that point, I mean, we've already fought a war and we've gone back to now around federalism and the reach of the federal government. And it's a period where we've kind of really gone back to, we're going to let states decide for their citizenry what all of this looks like. Right. In the former slaveholding South, right, what that looked like to them was, we want to go back to separate, but this time unequal. Right? There was no sense for them, right, up until 1954 that the separate had to be in any way equal, actually in practice, even though the law said something else. Right. So the funds that were available for education ended up going to support the education of whites, overwhelmingly. And black people were double taxed very often. Right. So they were asked to pay one tax, pay the regular tax that all citizens paid to the educational system, but those funds were white dollars. Then black people, if they wanted to educate black children in segregated schools, they had to educate them with black dollars. So you had to then pay the people who are sharecroppers, who are not wealthy, who are barely squeaking by. If they wanted education for their children, they had to come up with yet a second tax, right, in order to have that happen. And it was legal.
We'd love to hear your feedback. Email us at wideangle@acmi.tv. For information about this episode or to view other Wide Angle episodes, visit us online at acmi.tv/wideangle.
I think if I recall correctly from my read of your book, black communities would then essentially collect for the community itself and have a school built and get teachers and create on top of their tax dollars going to support white schools, create their own.
Well, what happened is a lot of northern philanthropists, Rockefeller Sr. Among them, right. And a man named Rosenwald, who had been the founder, the president of Sears and Roebuck Company, right, come up together. They're sort of traveling in the same circles, though they didn't come up with this together, but they decide that they're going to have these building funds because they have to figure out, they want to help. They believe deeply that education is central for the North and the South. I mean, you have to remember at the time, the South, pre-Civil War, had been the economic engine for the country. There was manufacturing. There was, of course, steel and railroads, and there were factories, like there were other things. But really, the thing that was keeping the U.S. as a whole afloat was the free labor in the South. So now you have the free labor of the enslaved are still in the South, but there's a question of, what if you don't educate them? Can we help them to become modern? Can we help them to can they help us as manufacturers do what we need to do if they can't do basic kinds of reading? And so the education of black people for the northern wealthy folks becomes an economic issue for the country as a whole. But
I was just going to say, I think the way that evolves, is a vocational education.
Yes.
Yes, as
Yes.
opposed to a classical education.
Yes. So what evolved as you're deciding that, okay, they have to have some kind of education, but the enlightened industrialists, which is the term, so you industrialists who came south and, were like, we want to have education, but they really did believe, and in part were forced to believe by Southerners who were, in control, that the only form of education that you can provide to Black people has to keep them in their place, has to not have them believe that they are equal, has to instill in them qualities of self-help and uplift and deference and respect and hard work, as if people who are sharecroppers don't know about hard work. But the explicit kind of goal of this education was, let's teach you how to work hard and to not want too much. And so what they came up with was a two-pronged thing. One, vocational, so that they could take working class service kinds of positions, but perform them in a way that would rise to the acceptable level for whites that they might come in contact with. The other thing was this rural school building campaign. So Rosenwald and Rockefeller had an organization, the General Education Board, where they would provide matching grants to poor Black communities to build their own schools, which sounds like this wonderful thing until you sort of get into the weeds a little bit. So on the surface, it's like, well, they're providing matching grants. The Black people will have schools. They will be separate, but still, they'll be able to learn. So when you get into the weeds a little bit, what you discover is, one, all of the education had to be vocational. There was no, it had nursing, making bricks, different service, laundry, how to perfect your being a laundress, bartending, this kind of thing. So they're professionalizing service roles in a way. But the other thing is, before you could get any matching grants from any of these different foundations, funders, your very poor community first had to raise $500. If you just wanted a one-room schoolhouse, which, for most folks that have not had the benefit of education, and, one room is fine. One-room schoolhouse, $500, you have to raise it. But it's not just you have to come up with the money. You also have to identify the land that the school will be built on, and have that land very often deeded to county officials. So you had to get someone somewhere who was a landowner in your town to agree free of charge to give you this land. And then, because it was often then given to the white community down the road. And then you had to purchase all the materials or have them donated, or go out into the forest and chop them down and negotiate with the mill about cutting them into boards. However it happened, you had to provide the materials that were needed. And then you had to provide the labor to build it. So once you had all of that and could show that you had all of that, your $500, the land, the labor, the materials, then these organizations would give you the matching fund sum of $500. So as it actually turned out, Black communities ended up spending way more than did these foundations to build these schools and all, although it's kind of come down in history as if these great foundations went and did all of this amazing stuff. But they did in it, and as is so true for poor people anywhere you look, it was worth it to them because education meant something very particular. And if the only way they could get it was to find somebody, a lot of land was deeded by Black churches. So, or schools, the church and the schools, the school would be in the basement of the church. Or that's a lot of what happened. But because it was important to Black communities and has always been important, they found ways, often heroic ways.
And then 1954 comes.
Yes.
We are going to, the Supreme Court directs us towards integration as the solution to this problem. And yet, again, a significant portion of the white community, both in the North and the South, resists this. it's white flight in the north. It's is it segregation academies in the south? What are the forms that that people who are going to resist integration are using around mid 50s, just 60,
Yeah,
70 years ago?
So what ends up developing is a campaign called massive resistance.
Yeah.
That's the Southern term that was actually brought into being by a sitting senator at the time, Senator Byrd of Virginia, who is the one who pointed out, he's like it doesn't say anything about education in the Constitution, and a lot of white people really believe that this was it wasn't constitutional because education was not actually mentioned in the Constitution. The fact that you have a Supreme Court decreeing an end of segregation because it was an unequal education that was on offer because of the segregation and the lack of funds and resources. As a result, they said this is not constitutional. We will fight it, and so you had a majority of senators and Congress people actually signing on to this massive resistance idea and saying, we will fight this every way we can. The rise of the White Citizens Council, which is a white supremacist organization, comes together following this ruling, which they call Black Monday. The ruling was handed down on a Monday. So they had a document that they called that was Black Monday, which they said, we will resist this because this is the end of the white race as we know it. This is the end of white power. This is the end of our world. You had whites who immediately turned to trying to rape children and women as a reassertion of authority and control. You had in Little Rock, the governor closed the schools for the better part of a year instead of, they tried to integrate, and then that went on for a year. It was horrible. It was like, this is not going anywhere. So he closed all of the schools and all the high schools in Little Rock. For a year. In Virginia, they closed Edwards County, they closed the schools for 5 years, as opposed to buckle under to this trying to have integration take place.
Meanwhile, as I recall, white children are going essentially to private schools.
Yes.
So
segregation academies. So one of the ways, because it's nice to say, well, we're gonna resist integration. We're not gonna have this go on. But of course, the white kids still had to be educated. Like no one was gonna have their children be uneducated. So they passed laws. It's all democratic and lawful, with air quotes. They passed laws saying that you could take public school dollars, that whites could take public school dollars and it will follow them to private schools. And private schools were not subject to the Brown v. Board decision. So you could maintain white only educational spaces, and then you just have the governor and the legislature say, and now whites are able to take the funds for their state and federal funding with them to these white academies. Black people cannot. So again, and it's a lawful because the state, this is what they've passed in a lawful way. And so you have strings, the White Citizens Council, which is very similar to the Klan, end up opening a string of segregation academies across the South in 13 states that are funded with taxpayer dollars, but are only open to whites.
Right. And that's effectively sort of the birth of the voucher. Yes?
That's both vouchers and charter schools would share that same history in a sense, because it's not the same thing, but it is the similar thinking, ideology, and practice that allows the money to follow you where you want to go, and the charter schools that they are publicly run, like publicly financed but privately run. Both of those come about in this period as whites are struggling mightily to figure out how to evade Brown v. Board.
Right. And certainly there is not a shortage of white resistance to integration in the North either.
Oh, no.
Certainly, I mean, Boston central to resisting
Yes.
busing
Y'all went crazy up
in the
there.
70s. A sense of how things worked up in our own neck of the woods here in Massachusetts in the North.
It's interesting that the South is usually the place where the majority of the story about segregation and resistance to Brown takes place, but the North had as much going on as anybody else.
Yeah.
So the idea of busing, Nixon comes along and is sort of like, now we're going to make it illegal to bus, or under Nixon, those in his administration said, we're going to make it illegal to bus children for the purposes of integration. And you had Joe Biden, former Vice President Joe Biden, who sponsored a bill saying that you could not use taxpayer dollars for gas to put in buses that were going to transport students for the purposes of education. And just Klan members in the Midwest as well as the North were taking to bombing both empty buses and buses that had children on them. Plus, just all of the scenes that those who are old enough remember of literal hand-to-hand combat in the Boston area. When Black children were trying to be bused to their busing really becomes, because by then you really do have the rise of the suburbs. And in some places like Chicago, you have mayors who are making really a big effort to promise that they will keep their school districts segregated so that whites don't leave and take their tax dollars with them to the suburbs. So you have all kinds of things going on in the North. One of the largest demonstrations ever in the North, there are 460,000 people in the New York area who march in protest of any potential desegregation plan at the time. So it's not that people in the North are feeling that this should happen. It doesn't impact them in the same way because they're in suburbs more. The South, people are living in closer proximity to each other. So it's a little bit different, but there is active resistance all across the North that comes in the form of funding as much as anything else. They just defund urban schools and schools where poor people live.
You've just watched episode 1 of my conversation with Professor Noliwe Rooks. I invite you to join us again next week as we focus on the trajectory of public education today, with efforts by some to reprivatize their school and the inevitable pushback by those committed to the promise of quality public education for all. I hope you tune in then.